This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. There are certain individuals throughout history who, for whatever reason, have been linked to specific historic events. One such person is a gentleman that I have mentioned previously on Body Bags, who was the chief medical examiner for Dallas. His name was Dr. Earl Rose, and for his time, he was highly educated, highly trained, and was one of the leading experts in the country on death investigation. It just so happens that his life intersected with three of the principal people involved in the JFK assassination. Actually, four. And three of the four had something in common. They all died as a result of gunshot wounds. Today on Body Bags, in a continuing effort to offer our friends out there a bit of forensic education, if you will, we're going to be talking about gunfire and gunfire-related deaths because, let's face it, it's part of the fabric of who we are in America. It happens every single day. There are many cases out there that are quite high profile, but there are others that go without a whisper. But the one thing they have in common is the trauma which they are subjected to at the hands of someone that has fired a weapon into their body. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. It's really hard to know, looking back through time, who the first victim of a gunshot wound was. And I'm not even talking about lethal. We know that the Chinese invented gunpowder, and we know that as early as the 1200s, they had a firearm. This is something that they would load. It's essentially a tube packed with gunpowder. They would spark this thing off, and they just put all manner of shrapnel down the barrel, which essentially turns this into a gigantic shotgun, if you will. Not very aerodynamic, but for its time, I'm sure that it was quite frightful for those that were on the business end of the weapon, if you will. To have these items flying through the air at you and slamming into your body, things that in the past maybe you wore armor for, like to defeat a sword or a spear blow, were insufficient to the task. And suddenly a whole new world opened up in warfare, and then eventually trickles down to the civilian world. But we do know that there was one gentleman that is the first recorded assassination victim by someone that had fired a weapon. And this gent's name, and he's rather fashionable, I'm looking at an image of him right now, was a guy named James Stewart, first Earl of Moray. And back in, I don't know, about 1570, he was summoned up north to a castle in Scotland. And there was another gentleman who was displeased with Moray, or Stewart rather, and from an open window fired a matchlock weapon at him, matchlock carbine as it's referred to as, and struck him down and killed him. This guy's name was James Hamilton. Now, over a period of time, I think much has been forgotten about that case, but every single day, Dave, in the news, we hear about people that die as a result of gunfire. It's part and parcel of who we are in America. It's a reality, whether, regardless of how you think about or feel about weapons, firearms specifically, it's the reality that we have to deal with in forensics and all that remains of individuals who have, in fact, been shot dead.
When I look at guns, Joe, my fear is when people don't respect them properly. And because you see the damage that can be done. When you see it up close and personal, it's shocking. I look back at our history, and I think about, you mentioned JFK, and I think about the weapon used with that and all of the experts that came into play about that shooting of JFK. And what they had to say about that Mannlicher Carcano. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. I've heard it said so many different ways. But you've got a cheap $12 mail order rifle that supposedly took down the leader of the free world from the third floor of the Texas School Book Depository from a shot that couldn't be made by experts. And he wasn't even he was not a good shot. And I think about those types of things, and I think about how you, as an expert, have to figure out, where did it come from? How did it happen? Is it even possible that this gun fired that, projectile and hit this victim? You have to figure that out based on what's left. And I have trouble figuring that out when I see the whole thing on film.
Yeah, you do. And the thing about it is, what's very interesting about the assassination of Kennedy is that Kennedy's gunshot wounds that he sustained were atypical in this sense. Most of the time in America, we don't have, like on a day-to-day basis, firearms-related deaths that come about as a result of a rifled weapon being fired, or let me rephrase that, a long arm being fired. And when I say that, like a shoulder-fired weapon, pistols are rifled, but the term rifle, when people hear the term rifle, they think a long arm or shoulder-fired arm. And those are the exception and not the norm. The lion's share of people that meet their end in America as a result of gunplay die as a result of handguns.
And isn't it odd that every time we have a shooting of any type, the two things they want to ban, assault rifles that aren't used in the crime and other military style weapons that oftentimes are not used in the crime, it's usually a handgun. And yet you never get a battle over handguns. Yeah. That's never, because it just doesn't make any kind of political sense, but that's a different discussion for a different day. Let me ask you this, Joe.
Yeah, buddy.
If somebody were to be creating hell on earth with a firearm, taking out the leader of the free world, would it be better to use a rifle that is made to shoot, if you're shooting from a long distance, a hunting type rifle or military type rifle? Well,
here's the thing. The genesis for most civilian hunting weapons, the genesis is military application. That's where as a matter of fact, for years, even my grandfather, he had a 30-06 rifle. He had a 30-30 rifle, and they were lever action rifles, like old cowboy. But the 30-06, yeah, exactly, like the Rifleman from the 60s.
Oh yeah,
Chuck Connors, man. But
Major League Baseball player.
And I think he played basketball too, didn't he, for the Sixers? I think, yeah.
Bless his heart.
Bless his heart. With rifles in particular, our troops came back from World War I, and the cartridge that those soldiers and Marines were familiar with when they got back home was referred to as the 30-06. And 30-06 became the gold standard, still by some measure today it is, for hunting, kind of mid-sized game, like individuals that are going to go out and hunt deer and maybe wild hog or, things like this. Well, that cartridge itself had its origin with a 1903 rifle. It's a bolt-action rifle that we had that all of our troops were issued. Now, you talk about if someone is plotting an assassination, first off, there are examples of people that have walked up on individuals and shot them, at very close range. Two presidents in particular I can think of. Well, actually three if you count Lincoln, but Garfield, who died, and he was shot at a train station. You had Teddy Roosevelt, who was shot with a pistol, and the only thing that saved his life was he had I think it was a silver cigar case that was in his pocket, and it deflected the round. He still caught shrapnel and still kept, hey, that's why Teddy Roosevelt's one of my favorite presidents. He kept on giving the speech.
Yeah.
I mean,
Really going to be stopped.
I mean, you take whoever you want. I'm going with Teddy Roosevelt every time. Love Teddy. And then of course you have Lincoln, who was famously assassinated, with a pistol, an old Derringer. So if you're looking for precision, and that's what a long arm gives individuals, that's generally where your mind is going to drift to. Somebody in a sniper's nest, our troopers that are deployed all around the world, we have people that are snipers. In fact, it's actually a term that comes from Scotland, sniper. Those were people that were game wardens and hunters out there, and they invented like the ghillie suit, where they're wearing all the rags all over their body and they can low crawl and approach. Well, we adopted that in the military, and the military uses it for military applications. But when you're wanting to reach out a great distance, you want to use a long arm as opposed to a pistol.
Personal, you're talking about the pistols there, and I didn't realize I had forgot about Teddy Roosevelt. Okay.
Yeah, most people do. Yeah.
But when I was thinking about assassinations, we're talking about JFK. I was thinking about how Lincoln, McKinley,
I forgot him, and Garfield.
Garfield, and Bobby Kennedy.
Bobby Kennedy were all shot with handguns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now, all right. Is that a different term, pistol and handgun? Or
No, it's not. They're essentially interchangeable.
But a pistol is not necessarily a revolver, right?
No, it's not. So you have let's break this down kind of logically so everybody can follow. So weapons generally fall into two categories. So firearms, that is, in the modern sense. So we're going to have long arms, which are rifled weapons that fire a projectile that spins down the barrel because of the grooves in the barrel. Okay. It's kind of like, and I'll tell you why, and that's actually called rifling. And I'll tell you why it was developed. It was developed around about the same time as the Civil War occurred in America. And before that, we were firing smoothbore muskets. And that means that you've got this huge chunk of lead that's traveling down a smoothbore barrel, and it's kind of bouncing along as it goes through the barrel. And it's not making the most out of the energy that's provided by the explosion in the rear. So its ability to travel a great distance and bring power on target drops precipitously. But if you escalate up to, say, for instance, the rifled round like that fired the mini ball, you got a 58 caliber round, huge chunk of metal going down range. In one of these Civil War weapons, that thing's rifled and it's spinning. So if you think about somebody that has taken a football, for instance, have you ever seen anybody, and I've done it, you've probably done it, throw a football and it comes out of your hand as a wounded duck. You ever seen that? And it kind of flops through the air. You don't get a tight spiral on it. It's the same principle with a bullet. If you take a football and you can throw a tight spiral, it preserves energy and it gives you more distance and you're more accurate with it. Same thing. So if you compare a wounded duck football throw with a musket, okay, smoothbore, and then you take a rifled weapon with a tight spiral, that's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it. And so we have long arms, and also following in the category of long arms, many times are shotguns. And so shotguns are smoothbore, okay, but they're meant for close engagements, but further away than, say, a pistol would be used for. and they put a lot of power and a lot of energy on target. So that's, you've got those two groups of long arms. So the other group of weapons that we commonly encounter, particularly in investigations out on the streets, are handguns. And they break out in the modern sense. And again, I'm qualifying these things in the modern sense. I'm not talking about the weapon that President Lincoln was assassinated with, which was a muzzle-loading Derringer that you had to use a ramrod to press to get the projectile down the barrel. It had to be primed, and then it was fired. I'm talking about now multi-shot weapons that we encounter on the streets in investigations. And with handguns, those are generally going to fall into two categories. So you're going to have revolvers, which old guys call them wheel guns as well. And you've seen revolvers in all manner of television shows over the years, old westerns, even detective programs from back in as late as the 80s, because it's what cops carried. Cops had classically, they had the 6-inch Smith & Wesson 38 Special revolver with an iron sight. And so the cylinder that the bullets, and most of the time, most revolvers hold 6 rounds. Sometimes you'll find them that hold 5. And you have others that will hold more, but those are kind of outliers. As the hammer is actuated and pulled back, you'll see the cylinder kind of spin, and it puts it on a fresh round. And you've only got 6, 6 times to fire this thing. And then you have to reload. It's kind of cumbersome. And that's the way, we kind of saw this change happen back in the 80s with service weapons that police officers were carrying. And they went from revolvers, which they'd carried for years and years, to semi-automatic handguns. Top of the list, probably to begin with, some of the ones you saw, there were 2 groups that you saw being employed by law enforcement agencies to begin with. Those were Glocks, which everybody's heard of now. It's an Austrian-made weapon. It's got a polymer frame. And then there were Berettas, which is an Italian weapon. And the reason a Beretta was very popular was because it's what our military troops carried in all branches, because they'd carried the 45 for years and years. And 45 ACP has a storied history. But again, it could only hold up to 7 rounds, not sufficient to the task. Weapons now, the semi-automatic weapons that police officers carry, if you're watching these videos, that are on YouTube and these sorts of things, and you're watching them, these live shooting instances, you'll see the cop fire multiple times, and it seems like it's never going to end. And that's because the magazines, which hold these rounds, are in the double digits, these rounds. And then they've got multiple magazines on their belt. So when you see a cop wearing their utility gear, you'll see, magazine holders, and you'll see them. And that's one of the skills you have to develop. You have to be able to drop a magazine, reload, and get back into the fight. And that's one of the things that's taught in military as well. So we've got long arms, rifles and shotguns. Then we've got handguns, which are generally going to be revolvers. They're still revolvers that people carry. I know people that prefer revolvers over semi-automatics. And then you've got the semi-automatics, your Glocks, Beretta, Sig Sauer, which I think is what the military has gone to now, HKs. And some of these can cost into the thousands and thousands of dollars. And they come in a variety of calibers as well. Dave, I've made mention of the first autopsy I ever participated in, which was a bludgeoning death. A guy had been beaten to death with a baseball bat at the hand of his brother.
Just to add something,
yeah,
I'm a horrible shot. but I'm excellent with a Louisville Slugger, and
There you
that is
go.
posted at all of my doors. And I've hollowed out the barrel and put
I
lead
hear you.
inside. If you
I
come
hear
into
you.
my house, you're not walking out. Just to let
Well,
you know ahead of time.
when I get to our blunt force
Yep, we'll do that.
blunt force trauma
Yeah.
lecture, I'm going to rely heavily upon you with that, because we will talk about baseball bats.
Yeah.
The first homicide, or the first death I was ever involved in as an autopsy technician, was actually bludgeoning. A guy had been beaten to death by a baseball bat. The first scene that I ever went on, where I was the primary investigator, was actually a gunshot wound. And that's, I know people might think, well, that's not unusual, Morgan. Well, yeah, it is, because you work for the coroner, you handle all manners of death. And generally, firearms related deaths are the least of what you handle. You handle the fewest of those.
Until you told me that, Joe, watching the news and politics,
Yeah.
I thought everybody in America had a gun loaded and cocked and ready to take something.
And that everybody's dying of a gun. Yeah, I know. Well, the news.
Work, that's what we did. We got a cup of coffee, shot somebody, and kept chucking. And then it just
most people get fished in by that. The lion's share of deaths that you work as an investigator, even going out on the field, in my field, I'm not talking about as a homicide detective, I'm talking as a medical legal death investigator, are going to be naturals. But it just so happened the first case that I ever worked by myself in the field was a gunshot wound. And it was with kind of an interesting weapon. It was a .22 Magnum revolver, which is actually a very powerful. You think of a .22, that's an imperial measurement, and we can talk about calibers.
Okay.
22 is essentially 0.2 inches in circumference around the actual projectile, and that's where you get that number. But that's an imperial measurement, which was given to us by the British, and we adopted that. So anytime you hear caliber, that's what we're talking about. That's an imperial measurement. But other so-called measurements for weapons are done metric. That's why you hear it in a lot of songs that are out there, the popular, talking about a 9mm Glock, and so 9mm is probably the most popular round, but that measurement is done in millimeters. So, and you've got 10mm pistols or handguns, but you have rifle rounds that two of the most popular for hunting are 6mm and 7mm. So, and it's hard. There's no dead on match for these. When you compare the imperial system, which is rooted in Great Britain, to the metric system, or the millimeter system, if you will, for measuring rounds. Even even in the military, you have to learn the metric measurement for firearms. So like the standard round for years and years in the military has been a 5.56 millimeter round. That's what goes into the rifle, and it's roughly about the size, believe it or not, Dave, the diameter or the circumference of the actual round itself is about roughly the size of a .22 round. It's not that big. It's just the amount of powder or propellant that is placed into that particular round. And then the weight of the bullet it's larger. The projectile is actually larger than, say, even a .22 long rifle. And so the amount of powder that's put behind it, the propellant, when that round hits something, it can rip it apart. And most of those rounds are what are called frangible, fragmenting rounds. So when they hit a target, they kind of come apart. And so you've got these tiny little particulate rounds that are going into a body, or bits of shrapnel, and they're ripping things to shreds in there as well. So there's a huge variety, and it takes you a while to get used to this environment, to try to be able to speak the lingo, because it's certainly a language all in of itself.
Okay, but when you're actually looking at a body on scene,
yeah,
are you able to understand what weapon or what type of weapon was used before you get them back? I mean, can you look at a body and go, yeah, that's a .22? I mean, can you do that, or what happens on scene when you're dealing with somebody who is a victim of being shot?
That's an excellent question, because you will see portrayed in movies, and I've even been around colleagues that will say, that looks like a 22, or that looks like a 9. And I learned early on in my career not to say that, because I was proven wrong so many times once we got back to the morgue. And interestingly enough, Dave, when I when I was writing, and I still teach my students this at Jack State, when you write a report, okay, I never say in one of my reports involving gunplay, I never say that the subject has a gunshot wound to the anterior chest or to the posterior chest or to the head. I'll say that the individual has a circular or irregular shaped defect, because if I call that defect or that hole in the body a gunshot wound in the field, and then that body has to make it back to the morgue, well, when the forensic pathologist gets the body in in perfect conditions for examination with the surgical lights and everything, first off, they might look at that and say, yeah, that's not a gunshot wound. That person was pierced by something here that might resemble a gunshot wound, or this is the tail end of a laceration. It's not a gunshot wound, but yet I've gone ahead and put it in an official report. And if the pathologist report comes out, those two things are conflicting when they're subpoenaed, and they can put you on the stand and say, well, look, your pathologist here made the statement that this is a gunshot wound, but yet you're saying, or that you said that it's a gunshot wound, but they're saying that it's something other than that. Who should we believe? And again, that's that kernel, that seed that's planted for reasonable doubt. So you have to be real careful with your verbiage.
So even on scene, you're thinking about, if this goes to trial, if I'm called, that's in the back of your head every step of the way.
Yeah, it is. And that's why it's so important that you remain very, very clinical, when you're at a scene. First off, you're at a great disadvantage, Dave, in the field. And I've mentioned this before. I'm not whining about it. I'm just saying you don't have like the same advantages you do in the morgue to examine a body, because the lighting is insufficient. You try to go out in the middle of the woods in the middle of the night on a moonless night, overcast night. You can't see your hand in front of your face, but yet you are going to attempt to give a detailed description of something that has got little tears in it that measure maybe 1 centimeter. Because of the orientation of the round when it goes through the body, you're incapable of doing that in that environment. So that's why I spoke very broadly, when I would write, and I would recommend to anybody that's going into forensics that you speak very broadly about field reports, particularly when it comes to injuries, because you don't know. One of the most embarrassing things that can happen is to have some lawyer get you up on stand, and the first, they'll talk to you, general terms, what's your background and what's your experience and all this. And they might say, hey, look, I was looking here at your CV, your resume, and I see that you graduated with your master's degree in forensic science, but where'd you go to medical school? I didn't go to medical school. But yet you've made an assessment at the scene that this is a gunshot wound. Certainly you have to have medical training in order to be that. Are you a board certified forensic pathologist? No, sir, I'm not. So even though I might be the best investigator in the world, all the while he's asking me these questions that I have to respond negatively to. Who's listening? Well, the jury's listening. So that's why with gunshot wounds in particular, I'm a bit cagey about it because I've gotten burned. I've had friends that have really gotten burned, and I learned from forensic pathologists. I had one old forensic pathologist that told me, let me bear the burden of that. You just indicate to me where you see defects in the body. It's like I'm amazed at when I go out on scenes, I'll have people will say, well, this is an entrance and this is an exit wound. Well, how do you know that? How do you know that that's an entrance? Well, because the entrance is always smaller than the exit. Prove it.
Joe?
Well, I've seen cases before. Well, I've seen a lot of cases too. And I've seen cases, particularly like individuals that are struck from behind in the shoulder blade, that flat bone. And it's a very nasty injury. And it might give you the appearance that it's an exit where it's actually an entrance. People shot in the spiny processes in their necks many times. That kind of blows out and gives you an impression of an exit. Very well might be an entrance. And so you can't make that determination in the field.
You're right back in the middle of JFK now, because in the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, there was always a battle over the neck wound.
Yes.
And they ended up using the neck wound to actually put a trach.
Start an airway. Yeah. And that's commonly done.
Right.
It's not like that's abnormal.
Right. Not like they messed it up or anything.
No. And you would still see some evidence, like, for instance, when the president was shot, and this goes into an assessment of range of fire, which is very important in what we do. When the president was shot, regardless of who fired the weapon and from where it was coming from, when you examined his body, and if it had actually been examined by Earl Rose instead of those buffoons on the East Coast that wound
I encourage you to go back and listen to our Body Bags episode about the assassination of JFK.
Please do. It was the biggest clown show on the face of the planet. And, Earl Rose almost went to jail over that because Dr. Rose was in the hallway at Parkland, and he was fighting, or he was protesting to the Secret Service. And he, according to him, one of the agents actually put their hand on their weapon and said the president's body is leaving here. And he was like, I'm the legal authority here. This is a homicide in Dallas County. And we talk about that extensively. But, Dr. Rose was actually involved in the autopsies of Tippit, who was allegedly shot by Oswald. And he did Oswald's autopsy as well. Interestingly enough, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Dave, I think he actually did Jack Ruby's autopsy.
What, the same guy?
Yeah, he died in a city jail of cancer, and I think he actually did that autopsy as well. And that was several years later. But you think about the intersection. If only Dr. Rose had been allowed to assess the president's injuries, because he would have probably. First off, he would have arrived at a different conclusion because that body would have been secured in his morgue and not be flown 1,000 miles or however the hell far it is to Bethesda, from Love Field. And he could have done that assessment appropriately and correctly. But, with President Kennedy's shooting, that's what we would refer to as a round fired from a distance. And when you're trying to assess the range of fire, you're into another complete level as far as forensic examinations go. Dave, I tell you, JFK has always been a head scratcher. From what I can tell at this point, it will always be a head scratcher. But you know what? We have the advantage of always reflecting back to the science, and that's what keeps us grounded. When
you did the show, and I was so thankful you did it, because there are so many things that the average Joe doesn't know. All we hear are the theories. Yeah. But when you get down to the forensics of what actually happened, and you're saying, here's all the things they did to make sure we would never know the truth, that's a real problem. But you were just talking about range of fire. And I'm concerned and curious about how can you determine? I mean, you've got a bullet being fired from a weapon. Yeah. How can you determine range of fire? I mean, I guess I understand stippling, so I could understand a contact wound. Mm-hmm. If you're, touching my skin, I'm going to get, but beyond that, how can you really tell how far it was? Well, with the president, some people will use the term long range shot. And yeah, it is a long range shot, but scientifically that means nothing. So what does that mean? Really? Well, it's actually an indeterminate range if you want to look at it from a purely clinical sense, because there's no way, like once you get out beyond, some people will debate you about this. Some people say it's 18 inches. I hear people say all the way out to 36 inches. Once you get beyond that outer marker right there, there's no, President Kennedy could have been shot from 30, let's just say, we'll be generous, from 36 inches out to infinity.
and there wouldn't be any evidence on the body. Okay. All you're going to have is a defect. Now, the one thing that you see with indeterminate range rounds, if you're talking about a rifled round that's passing, I encourage anybody that hasn't seen the quote unquote magic bullet. That bullet has been fired. It's got rifling on it, and you can actually see it running down the long axis. It's just that it's so intact, but that's a story. That's a story I've already told, actually. But when you see the wound that is generated traditionally, because, President Kennedy's body got so kind of boogered up and orientation was all off and everything else. But if you look at an indeterminate range projectile or projectile that has been fired from an indeterminate range, the only thing you're going to see is what's referred to as a friction ring. And what that means is, going back to my example of a tight spiral on a football, it's spinning. Okay. Well, think about a spinning. Now, this is painful to think about. All right. Just this in and of itself. And you wouldn't notice it when you're being shot, but as that bullet is spinning, and it is spinning like nobody's business. All right. When it strikes the skin, it actually, Dave, twists the skin like this. Okay. So you get this abrasion ring around a circular defect, and you'll see the little abraded area where it kind of twists. I could have sworn before I've actually seen on the outer margins of one of these things, little kind of hash marks that look like indication of rifling, and they're kind of fan shaped. The doctor told me I was out of my mind. I wasn't really seeing that. So I was like, oh, okay, well, whatever. But anyway, it twists the skin, and that friction that's created on the skin just for that moment, it abrades that area. It tears the skin. It insults the skin. But beyond that, you're not going to have any powder deposition. There's not going to be any debris blown out of the barrel, because none of that crap is aerodynamic. So let's just say you're in that multi-storied structure of the Texas school book depository, that you're up there and you're in the sniper's nest and you're firing this round. Well, by the time that round reaches the end of the muzzle, okay, which is in a twinkling of an eye, that round is going downrange and it's leaving a cloud behind it. And you can see this in high-speed camera, slow motion on weapons. I encourage everybody to go look these up on the inner zones out there. You see this kind of cloud that rises up out of the barrel, and the projectile actually emerges from that. Well, just take a look in that and they're everywhere when you see them. That slow motion cloud that's coming out doesn't go very far. As a matter of fact, really quickly, you can see it begin to descend to the earth. None of that stuff has the aerodynamic qualities that a spinning lead core projectile has as it's going down range, and it can stay on target for a protracted time. So it's not carrying any of that debris with it. So when you have an indeterminate range, if you're in court, the attorney might say, well, gee whiz, how far away was this round? Was the shooter, I don't know, have no idea. So you're telling me with all your knowledge, yeah, I'm telling you based upon a lot of scientific study over the years that it's impossible to tell, because there's no deposition. Now, when you get into what we would refer to as, we'll kind of do these backwards. The next tier to this is going to be like an intermediate range. You look at a case of, well, if you just look at, for instance, Oswald. When Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby in the garage, you can see him. I mean, and there's that classic freeze frame where he's kind of hunched over and he's got this pained look on his face, and Ruby is extending that snub-nosed 38 caliber revolver. He's holding a revolver here, and he fires it at Ruby. Well, Ruby is in kind of and this goes to what we're trying to figure out also with trajectory. Ruby is kind of tilted down like this when he's shot. he kind of hunches like this. That round actually traveled downward in his body. I mean, it passed through several organ systems. He didn't have a shot, no pun intended, of surviving. But that's an intermediate round with him, intermediate range. So, it's hard to determine because you're seeing it. It's kind of like Ruby's POV, but you're behind Ruby, and it's hard to gauge distance and depth from that range. But I would say that based upon the muzzle position relative to relative to Oswald when that weapon was fired, you might see some deposition. Now, do you remember, Dave, what color sweater Ruby was wearing when he was shot?
No. Well, when Ruby was shot, you mean?
No, I'm sorry. When Oswald was shot, I
can remember as the picture that was in the newspaper that basically shows him like you were just bent over and the pained look on his face. I don't remember much else.
He's wearing a black sweater and a white shirt. The collar is kind of popping up out of it. And if we were to look at his body, he was actually taken to Parkland.
Really?
He died in the same area that the president died in. No, he did.
Gosh.
He did. I think Tippett was taken to Parkland too. But yeah, so
I know they say
Oswald, they were. If I remember this, some of this might be lore that's coming back up in my mind. I think they were in adjacent trauma rooms. He was adjacent to the room that the president had been brought into when they started running the code on him.
Well, it would make sense that you've got a hospital and you bring certain victims into certain rooms.
It's a level, whatever it's called, level 1 trauma center. I think.
So I would imagine that actually, as weird as it is, makes perfectly good sense.
Yeah. Can you imagine being a nurse on duty that day and you had handled the president and now you got the guy who's been on the news?
Wow.
But anyway, he's wearing a black sweater. So I got to tell you, Dave, this is where our testing comes in, because if you just try to eyeball that sweater to get an idea of any kind of debris that's on that sweater, you're not going to see it with the unaided eye. That sweater, hopefully they saved it. Hospital emergency rooms have a bad habit of cutting things off. You see that portrayed many times, and it's a real thing. If they preserve that sweater, and the sweater would be taken to the crime lab, and they could analyze it, and they could actually use alternative lighting and chemical testing to give you the deposition of the gunshot residue that's on the outside of that sweater, and it'll give you a range of fire. So just imagine this: if you're firing an intermediate range, the deposition of the powder that is embedded either on a article of clothing or on skin is going to be greatly spread out. It's kind of like a water hose, when you put it on spray mode, and it's kind of looks like a fountain coming out of it, spraying far. The closer you get to the nozzle, the tighter it gets. So with that, if he's within, let's just say it's 18 inches, it might be, I don't know, the deposition could be, I'm just spitballing here, maybe 12 inches by 12 inches. That's the deposition that you're talking about, high and low, or high and wide. And that deposition is going to dictate. Now, what they would have done is they will take that same pistol that Ruby used and go to the state crime lab, and they will fire. And this is something we have to have done by the crime lab. You turn that over to the ballistics section, firearms examination, and they have an indoor range where they'll go and they'll take a white T-shirt. And it's really impressive. If you've never seen this done, white T-shirt, hang it up, and they will fire at various ranges into fresh white T-shirts. And as they get closer and closer, that deposition tightens up and tightens up. And there's always the defect in the sweater that's always constant. It's right there, but as you're getting closer and closer, it's tightening down.
Do they have to put the shirt on something else that actually can simulate the flesh?
No, they'll hang it. Okay. They generally hang it and do it. Now, that's different types of testing than, say, in a ballistics lab, where they go and they fire into a tank filled with cotton.
Right.
Strips of cotton, or they fire into a water tank that's got a catch basin in the bottom. And that way they can, let's say we take a projectile out at autopsy. All right. Let's say they remove the projectile out of Oswald's body fired from Ruby's gun. Well, that that projectile, more than likely, that 38 special round is going to be deformed in some way. It's not going to be pristine.
Oh, except unless it goes through the president of the United States and ends up on the
and makes a left-hand turn, and it goes it goes through the other guy's wrist, and what are you going to do?
Break 7 bones and still in it pristine. You know what? That's the metal that was used in Iron Man. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no kidding. And one of the things you're looking for is to try to compare the question weapon, which would be the projectile or the question projectile that you recover from the body, with the round that's fired out of Ruby's gun, and you compare the two. And people will say, well, you know what? It was on TV. It's his weapon. TV doesn't stand up in court. I'm sorry to burst your bubble. That has to be tested, and scientifically, they have to do a comparison. If the thing were to go to trial, of course, it is what it is, and you try to compare it. Now, the closer you get to where you're in a circumstance where you've got a round that's fired, let's say, how can I say it? You've got a round that is fired at an individual, say at what would be called close range. Close range, you're going to be within a couple of inches of the target. And buddy, when you see the damage that's done, that powder, the unburned powder in particular, rages out of that weapon. And say if it strikes skin, it's going to look like, this is kind of disgusting. It's going to look like a huge collection of blackheads to most people the first time they see it, like a huge concentrate. You're looking and you're thinking, this is really bizarre. But of course, you've got a defect right in a hole, right in the center of it, but it's surrounded by all this kind of unburned powder. And that unburned powder actually gets beneath the skin. It's there. So if you took a section of that skin and you cut it and you put it on microscopic slide, guess what? When you look at that section microscopically, you can actually see the powder. And what I mean by that, the unburned powder comes in different shapes depending upon the actual granules of powder. You can have disc shaped, cylindrical shaped. You can have pyramidal shaped powder. And I'm talking about the individual grains of powder that come from a particular company. So that's kind of an identifier that can be used by ballistics experts.
That come from a specific company?
Yeah, because each manufacturer might make a powder where the individual grains of powder are in a particular shape, and that shape is unique to them. So, we try to find all of these components that we can, in addition to doing regular gunshot residue testing, where we're looking for chemical evidence, where we're looking for barium, antimony, and lead, which are components of actual gunpowder or propellant. I prefer to use the term propellant as opposed to gunpowder.
When they do the test to see if I fired a gun, if I have fired a weapon, is that what's that, the GSR?
Yeah, GSR, gunshot residue testing.
Okay.
Yep.
And that's where you're going to be able to tell. If I wash my hands, I shoot a weapon, wash my hands, scrub them down hard, you still going to be able to test me?
No, probably not.
That quick, it can be gone.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there's even evidence that people put their hands in their pockets after firing a weapon, compromise the concentration of it.
Right.
And listen, just because you have it on your hands doesn't mean you fired a weapon.
Right.
It means you may have held a weapon. It means that you were in proximity to a weapon. They did one study, Dave, years ago, testing people that worked in an ammunition factory, and they were testing them every day as they were leaving, and they're actually putting together components of large projectiles, and they were getting like 45% negatives on these individuals. And even worse than that is back, and this existed before I came into the field. They used to do paraffin tests, which were where you would have a suspect place their hand into warm wax, and they would peel the wax off of the hands, and whatever it captured, it's the same thing as doing a tape lift. So you're looking for that residue that's contained within, this.
Wow.
I don't know if you want to call it a medium or resin, whatever it is, but it's called a paraffin test. So after you get past close range, then you have what's referred to as press contact or hard contact. Depending upon where you are and where you studied, and what pathologists you've worked around in my field, they'll call it different things. I've heard hard contact, press contact, and most of the time you see press and hard contact wounds with self-inflicted wounds. And it's most of the time I've always felt it's because the individual is purposed. They want to ensure that they are going to get the job done. Now, when you have this occur, that round that is being initiated, when it travels out of the muzzle of that weapon, it's creating a cavity in the head. Okay, and let's just say it's a self-inflicted to the head, or you could use the sternum as well because that happens too. And it's pressed, and it's like pressed hard against the skin, and it creates a seal. When that weapon is discharged, it's not just a projectile coming out. We've already talked about unburned powder. You've got smoke that's coming out. But the other thing you've got that's coming out, and the reason press contact gunshot wounds are so destructive, is that you've got heated gas coming out. And we all know from 8th grade physical science class that heated gas expands, and it expands at a rapid rate. So you'll get these grotesque injuries to the head, and it's not just the projectile doing it, it's also that gas expanding inside the cranial vault. And you'll see fractures that run along the suture lines. If you know what a suture line is, it's when you look at a human skull, you've got these wavy lines. We've talked about this before, where the skull kind of interlocks with one another. Mm-hmm. And many times you'll see it literally fracture along the suture lines, both posteriorly, anteriorly, laterally, and it's devastating. And then the bone, after it passes through bone, those bits of bone become shrapnel.
There was that guy in Philadelphia that shot himself during the city council meeting. Remember that? It was on TV.
Oh yeah,
years ago?
Yeah. It was actually Bud Dwyer. He was the former treasurer of the state of Pennsylvania. I actually got to see that raw footage.
You could see his head expand.
Well, yeah, and you can see if you look very carefully. He uses, I think that's a Colt Python. I think it's a 357 that he's using, and it's an interoral gunshot wound. So it's a great example of the expansion of gas, because when he fires, back in the day when we got that tape, we put it on, and we got it at the coroner's office. We had that tape on like the most high-end VCR that there was at the time. It had, and I don't understand about the technology, I think multiple heads in it. And so it could slow things down.
Had a forehead player.
Yeah, and you could see a flash inside of his mouth. Mm-hmm. And I've had cases where people videotape themselves, and you see the cheeks expand like a chipmunk. And you'll get what are referred to as stria, which are the same as stretch marks. You'll get stria on the cheeks because it expands so fast, because the rapid expansion of the gas, that it creates these curvilinear lines that are called stria, and they're stretch marks essentially, but it's an acute stretch mark. It's not like somebody's getting heavier or whatever in life, and their limbs are beginning, or the diameter of their legs are beginning to expand, or their tummy or whatever. It's different than that. It's a real unique feature that you see. And then not to mention the damage that the round is creating as it's traveling through the body.
That's just amazing. I remember that video of his head. That the one thing I remember is that it stretched. It was almost cartoonish. Yeah, very quick. But it was so shocking that I've only seen it once or twice, and I remember it. And it was many years ago in a newsroom when I saw it. And that's when you were explaining that. I was wondering why they did that.
I'm glad you brought that up. I actually show that video in every year when I do my lecture in medical legal death investigation on firearms related deaths. Because it's a great example of the camera never blinks. I don't know who the camera operator was, but they stayed on him as he kind of slides down the wall, and you can appreciate the volume of blood that issues forth from the nose and the mouth. And a lot of that has to do with how thin the floor is, the hard palate is, leading up into the skull. It's almost eggshell-like in thickness or thinness, I guess. And so it shatters like that. and the brain is so vascular, you have this copious amount of blood that's coming out. And if you listen very carefully on that tape, Dave, you can actually hear the blood flowing, which is something I've never encountered before. And I was, from a practitioner standpoint, I was fascinated by that.
Yeah.
But it's a great teaching tool because you really begin to kind of understand the power and the destructive nature of firearms. And for those of us that work in forensics, that teach forensics, or that formerly worked in our field, an understanding of firearms and their function, their purpose is essential to being a successful investigator, to understand the science and the mechanism of modern firearms. Because if you don't understand these things that you're encountering out on the street, there's no telling what kind of interpretation you'll wind up making. So it's important that we always say that we're studied up. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.